January 24, 1944, Anzio, Italy. The building had no right to still be standing. Half its facade had collapsed into the street 3 days earlier, leaving exposed wooden beams jutting into the winter air like broken ribs. Inside, what had once been a neighborhood shop, perhaps a grocer's, judging by the shattered glass cases, Captain David Tibbs pressed his fingers against the pulse point of a 19-year-old corporal's neck and felt nothing. The fifth man he'd lost that morning. The smell of blood, mixed with plaster dust, had become so constant that he no longer noticed it. But he noticed when he stopped noticing, and that frightened him more than the artillery fire that rattled the remaining windows every 15 minutes. He had been here 72 hours. Or was it 80? Time had developed a strange elasticity in this place, where the front line didn't hold still. The groaning came in 3 languages now: English, German, Italian. When he'd arrived on the morning of January 21st, setting up his aid station in this half-destroyed building because it had most of its roof intact, the fighting had been 2 streets north. By noon, it was in the next block. By evening, it was here. The war had flowed around him like water around a stone, and somehow he'd become the stone, immovable, operating on whoever came through the door, regardless of whose uniform they wore. Tibbs was 31 years old, though his hands looked older, perpetually stained despite scrubbing, the nails worn short, 2 fingers on his left hand slightly crooked, from setting them himself after a shelling incident in North Africa. He had joined the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1939, believing, as so many had, that it would be over quickly. 5 years later, he could perform an emergency amputation in under 12 minutes, had developed an instinct for which wounds were survivable and which weren't, and had stopped praying before surgeries because prayer took time and time killed patients. The front line at Anzio was supposed to have been straightforward. Operation Shingle, the Allied amphibious landing, had begun on January 22nd, designed to outflank German defensive positions and drive toward Rome. Instead, the landing force had become trapped on a narrow beachhead, subjected to constant German counterattacks from the surrounding hills. The Wehrmacht had clear sight lines to virtually everything below, turning the coastal plain into what soldiers had already begun calling the bowling alley, because the German gunners could knock down anything that moved with the ease of toppling pins. Tibbs's aid station occupied what strategic maps would have marked as no man's land, except that this particular piece of ground kept changing hands so rapidly that neither side could claim it. The British had been here yesterday morning. The Germans held it by afternoon. Now at dawn, he couldn't say with certainty whose territory this was, only that wounded men from both armies kept arriving, carried by comrades or crawling through the door on their own, and he kept operating. The first German soldier had appeared just after noon on the second day. Tibbs had been working on a British lance corporal with a sucking chest wound when he heard boots on the broken floor behind him. He turned to find a young Wehrmacht private, no more than 20, supporting another soldier whose left leg dangled at an obscene angle, the bone visible through torn gray-green fabric. They stared at each other across 10 feet of blood-spattered floor. The British corporal on the table made a wet, whistling sound with each breath. The German private's hand rested on his holstered pistol, but he made no move to draw it. His companion was unconscious. A mercy. "I don't speak German," Tibbs had said, his voice steady. "But put him on that table there." He pointed. "I'll get to him after this one." The private hesitated, then complied. He stayed, watching Tibbs work with the intensity of someone trying to determine whether this was a trap. When Tibbs finished sealing the British soldier's chest wound, a procedure involving a drainage tube and prayers to a god he wasn't sure he believed in, he turned to the German, whose compound fracture required immediate attention to prevent fatal blood loss. The private watched him set his friend's leg, with the same methodical care he'd given the British soldier. Something in the young man's face changed, a visible shift, like ice cracking, and when Tibbs finished, the German private saluted him. Not the stiff-armed Hitler salute, but an old-fashioned military salute, the kind that transcended political ideology. Then he left, half carrying his now conscious companion, stepping carefully over the rubble. After that, they came in twos and threes, German soldiers bringing their wounded, sometimes staying to help hold down a patient during surgery, then disappearing back into the war outside. Tibbs didn't ask questions. He had morphine for perhaps 15 more patients, surgical thread for 30 if he was careful, and a growing collection of men sleeping side by side on the floor, regardless of which army they served. The most dangerous part became crossing the street between the two halves of his makeshift hospital. The shop had a storage room across the way, 30 feet of open space that might as well have been a mile when snipers from both sides were hunting targets. He'd lost 2 orderlies trying to make that crossing, 1 British, 1 German prisoner who'd volunteered to help. On the 3rd day, Tibbs took 2 pieces of white cloth, torn from sheets he'd been using for bandages, and painted crude red crosses on them with blood from the surgery. There was a certain grim irony in that, using the substance he was trying to keep inside human bodies as a pigment. He tied 1 cloth around each upper arm, waited until the artillery barrage paused for the inevitable reload, then raised both arms high above his head, and walked into the street. The first sniper shot cracked past his left ear, close enough that he felt the pressure wave. Tibbs kept walking, arms up, red crosses visible against the gray sky. A second shot hit the pavement 5 feet ahead, spraying concrete fragments against his legs. He didn't stop, didn't speed up, just maintained that slow, steady pace directly down the center of the street. Then silence. The shooting stopped so abruptly that the absence of gunfire was itself a kind of sound. Tibbs could feel eyes on him from a dozen positions, rooftops, windows, shell holes, but no one fired. He crossed the remaining distance to the storage building, entered, retrieved the medical supplies he needed, and crossed back the same way, arms up, red crosses visible. That slow, measured walk. From that moment, something shifted in the unspoken rules governing this particular pocket of hell. Tibbs moved freely between buildings, between wounded men, between the unofficial boundaries that divided British and German positions. Soldiers on both sides watched him work with a kind of reverent silence, as if his presence created a temporary neutrality, a bubble of civilization in the midst of orchestrated savagery. But the most critical moment, the one that would define not just his war, but his understanding of what humanity meant under pressure, came on the afternoon of the 4th day. Friedrich Meyer had been unconscious when they brought him in, which was probably a mercy. The shrapnel had caught him during a German counterattack, multiple fragments tearing through both legs with enough force to shred muscle and nick arteries. He was bleeding out fast, leaving a dark trail across the floor, as 2 of his companions carried him into Tibbs's aid station. "Table, now!" Tibbs snapped, pointing. He was already moving, hands automatically preparing for surgery, mind calculating odds. Both legs compromised, multiple fragment wounds, likely arterial damage in the right femoral, blood pressure dropping fast, maybe 20 minutes before irreversible shock set in, maybe less. Meyer's eyes fluttered open as they lifted him onto the operating table, and Tibbs saw the moment awareness returned. That flash of recognition that he was in enemy hands, followed by the deeper understanding that he was dying, and the nationality of the doctor was irrelevant compared to that fundamental fact. Unteroffizier Friedrich Meyer, the man gasped in German, giving his rank and name as if it mattered, as if proper military protocol could impose order on the chaos of his shredded legs. "I don't speak German," Tibbs said, already cutting away the remains of Meyer's trousers. "But hold still and don't die. Those are your orders." Meyer likely didn't understand the words, but tone carried meaning. He nodded once, then mercifully passed out again as Tibbs began work. The surgery took 90 minutes, an eternity when measured in heartbeats, an instant when measured in the precision required. Tibbs found 3 arterial tears, sealed them with stitches so small they'd be invisible once the wounds healed. He removed 47 pieces of shrapnel, counting each one because counting helped him stay focused, helped him not think about how this man he was saving had probably been trying to kill British soldiers an hour earlier. When he finished, Meyer was alive but weak, having lost enough blood that his survival depended entirely on the next 48 hours of care. Tibbs had him moved to the floor with the other patients, German and British soldiers lying within arm's reach of each other, all of them too injured or exhausted to care about the uniforms. That was when the officer appeared. Tibbs had just started working on a British sergeant with the abdominal wound when he heard boots on the stairs, different from other boots, measured and authoritative. He glanced up to see a German officer in the doorway, perhaps 40 years old, with an MP-40 submachine gun held at ready position. The man's uniform was cleaner than most, suggesting he'd come from a command position rather than front-line fighting. Behind him stood 2 enlisted men with rifles. The officer surveyed the room, taking in the scene. British soldiers on tables and floors, German soldiers beside them. Tibbs, in his blood-stained uniform, bent over a patient. The officer's expression was unreadable, carved from the same stone that produced efficient German staff work and brutal military discipline. "You are Captain David Tibbs, Royal Army Medical Corps?" the officer asked in accented but precise English. "I am," Tibbs replied, not looking up from the sergeant's abdomen. The wound was deeper than he'd hoped, possibly involving the intestines, requiring immediate attention. "I am Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich," the officer said, "and I am informing you that you are now a prisoner of war of the Third Reich. You will accompany us." Tibbs had imagined this moment during the past 3 days, wondered what he would do when it inevitably arrived. Now that it was here, he found he felt nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. He finished the stitch he was making, a clean suture, properly spaced, before responding. "I'm the only surgeon for 3 blocks in any direction," he said, his voice flat and conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than imprisonment. "I have 17 patients in this building who require immediate care, including 8 of yours. If you take me, they'll all die within an hour, including yours." The words hung in the air between them, measured and precise as the stitches Tibbs was making. Hauptmann Dietrich stepped fully into the room, his boots crunching on fallen plaster. He looked at the soldiers on the floor, saw Unteroffizier Meyer with his bandaged legs, saw the young private Tibbs had operated on yesterday now sleeping peacefully, saw 3 other German soldiers in various states of injury and recovery. "You are treating enemy combatants," Dietrich observed. "I'm treating wounded men," Tibbs corrected. He tied off the suture he'd been working on, started another. "Their army's our enemy. They aren't. Not to me." Dietrich moved closer, standing now at the edge of Tibbs's operating area, close enough that the doctor could smell cigarette smoke on the officer's uniform. The MP-40 was still held ready, still capable of ending this conversation with a single burst of fire. The Geneva Convention requires that military medical personnel be respected and protected, Tibbs continued, still not looking up from his work, but it also permits their capture, if military necessity requires it. You have to decide, Hauptmann, whether your military necessity is greater than your soldiers' survival. It was the truth, stated without drama or emotion. Tibbs had no cards to play, no leverage beyond the simple arithmetic of life and death. Take him, and 8 German soldiers died. Leave him, and they lived. The calculation was elementary. Dietrich stood silent for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt longer. Tibbs could feel the officer's gaze on him, could sense the internal deliberation. Military orders versus pragmatic reality. Ideology versus immediate necessity. The rules of war versus the chaos of this particular battlefield. Then Dietrich turned to his enlisted men and gave a curt order in German. They lowered their rifles. The Hauptmann looked back at Tibbs one last time, his expression still unreadable, then walked to the door. He paused at the threshold, hand on the frame, and spoke without turning around. "You will continue to treat my soldiers as you would your own." "I already do," Tibbs replied. Dietrich nodded once, then left. The sound of his boots faded down the stairs, and the war outside continued its rhythmic destruction, indifferent to this small pocket of mercy carved out by circumstance and stubbornness. Tibbs finished the surgery on the British sergeant, then moved to check on Meyer, who was conscious now and staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone trying to process impossible contradictions. The German had expected to die, either from his wounds or from deliberate neglect by an enemy doctor. Instead, he'd been saved immediately, operated on without delay, given the same morphine and care as British soldiers. Meyer turned his head when Tibbs approached, their eyes meeting across the divide of language and nationality. The doctor checked the bandages, felt for fever, assessed the wounds with professional detachment that somehow conveyed more care than sentiment ever could. "You'll live," Tibbs said, knowing Meyer couldn't understand the words. "Both legs intact, all major arteries sealed. You'll walk again, though, probably with a limp." Meyer said something in German, perhaps thanks, perhaps a question, perhaps just an acknowledgement of the surreal nature of his survival. Tibbs nodded as if he understood, then moved on to the next patient. The war at Anzio would continue for 4 more months, turning the beachhead into one of the bloodiest stalemates of the Italian campaign. Over 23,000 Allied casualties, similar numbers for the Germans, all for a piece of coastal plain that could be observed from the surrounding hills with such clarity that soldiers took to calling it the factory, as if being killed there was just another form of industrial production. Tibbs stayed in his improvised aid station for 6 more days before British reinforcements finally secured the area and evacuated him with his patients. In that time, he operated on 47 more soldiers, British, German, American, 1 Italian civilian caught in crossfire, and lost 11 despite his best efforts. The ones who survived remembered him with the peculiar intensity of people who owe their lives to someone, though most would never see him again. Meyer woke in a British field hospital, his legs still attached and his mind struggling to reconcile experience with expectation. According to everything he'd been taught, years of Nazi propaganda about British brutality, American savagery, the subhuman nature of Germany's enemies, he should be dead or worse. Instead, he was alive, properly treated, recovering in a clean bed with adequate food and water. The cognitive dissonance was painful in a way his wounds weren't. Propaganda didn't account for British doctors who saved enemy soldiers under fire. It didn't explain why his captors treated him with professional courtesy, rather than the sadistic cruelty he'd been promised. The foundations of his worldview had cracks now, small fissures that would only widen with time. 3 months later, after the Allies finally broke out from Anzio and drove toward Rome, Meyer was transported to a prisoner of war camp in Naples, then later moved by ship to the United States, specifically to a facility outside Houston, Texas, where he would spend the next 3 years working at a local canning factory. What awaited him there would complete the transformation that Captain Tibbs had begun on that operating table in Italy. The prisoner of war camp in Texas occupied 200 acres of flat land where cotton had grown before. The war turned the soil to military purposes. Rows of barracks housed approximately 3,000 German prisoners, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire and guard towers at regular intervals. To Meyer, Arriving in August of 1944, after months of recovery and transport, it looked like every prison camp he'd imagined, except for one detail that became apparent almost immediately. The guards weren't cruel. This shouldn't have been surprising. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, and the United States took those requirements seriously, both from genuine humanitarian concern and from practical calculation. They wanted their own prisoners in German hands to be treated well. But Meyer had spent 5 years marinating in Goebbels' propaganda about American barbarity, about the racial degeneracy of a nation built on immigration, about the ruthless capitalism that reduced humans to commodities. None of it prepared him for guards who were simply doing their jobs. The camp routine began at 6 in the morning with roll call, followed by breakfast. And this was where the first crack in Meyer's expectations widened into something approaching a chasm. The food wasn't just adequate, it was abundant. Eggs, bacon, bread, coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz grain mixture he'd drunk in Germany since 1941. Portions were generous. Seconds were available. And the quality exceeded what he'd eaten as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. "They're fattening us up," another prisoner said that first morning, eyeing his plate with suspicion. "Making us soft before the real punishment begins." But the real punishment never came. Instead, there was work. Meyer and hundreds of other prisoners were transported daily to the canning factory, 6 miles from camp, where they processed vegetables and fruits under the supervision of civilian foremen. The work was hard, standing for 8 hours, repetitive motions, heat from the sterilization equipment. But it was also exactly what the Geneva Convention specified for prisoner labor, non-military work, reasonably compensated, with conditions comparable to those of civilian workers. The revelation came in the details. Meyer earned 80 cents per day, not much by American standards, but more than he'd ever been paid in the Wehrmacht. He worked an 8-hour shift with scheduled breaks and a lunch period. The factory had safety equipment, first aid stations, and protocols for preventing injuries. When a pressing machine malfunctioned one day and caught a prisoner's hand, American supervisors shut down the entire line immediately, rushed the injured man to medical care, and spent 2 days investigating what went wrong before restarting operations. This wasn't how economies worked in Germany. This wasn't how labor was valued or humans were treated. Meyer had grown up in Hamburg during the Depression, had seen unemployment and desperation, had watched the Nazis promise to restore German dignity through discipline and hierarchy. The canning factory didn't operate on discipline and hierarchy, or rather, it had those things, but they served a different purpose: safety, efficiency, mutual benefit. "My father worked in a factory before the war," Meyer told another prisoner during a lunch break, 3 months into his captivity. They were sitting outside, eating sandwiches provided by the factory, watching Americans play baseball in a field beyond the fence. He worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, for barely enough to feed us. No safety equipment, no medical care if he got injured. "Just work until you broke, then get replaced. That's capitalism," the other prisoner said, a committed Nazi from Bavaria who still wore his party pin hidden in his shoe. "Exploitation of workers." "Then what's this?" Meyer asked, gesturing at the scene around them. "We're prisoners, enemy aliens. Why do they treat us better than German factories treated German workers?" The Bavarian had no answer, or rather, he had the answer provided by years of ideological training, that this was an aberration, a trick, a temporary facade that would collapse to reveal the truth underneath. But as months passed and the facade never collapsed, even he began to doubt. The weight gain was real and measurable. Meyer had arrived at the Texas camp weighing 143 pounds, malnourished from months of combat rations and recovery. Within 6 months, he weighed 165 pounds. Within a year, 170. The camp doctor, an American captain who reminded Meyer uncomfortably of Captain Tibbs, pronounced him healthier than he'd been in a decade. You had rickets as a child, the doctor observed during a routine examination, studying Meyer's bone structure. Poor nutrition during formative years. Your teeth show signs of calcium deficiency. When did you last see a dentist? Meyer tried to remember. 1937, 38. Dental care hadn't been a priority in Hamburg. Not for working-class families trying to survive the Depression, and certainly not once the war started. "We'll fix that," the American doctor said, making notes. "Schedule him for dental work," he told a nurse. "Full examination, cavity treatment, whatever he needs." "I'm a prisoner," Meyer said, confused. "Why would you—" "Because you're a human being," the doctor interrupted, "and because the United States signed the Geneva Convention. Also because dental infections can lead to serious health problems, and preventing those is easier than treating them. Self-interest and humanitarian concern often align Unteroffizier Meyer. That's something we figured out that apparently Germany didn't. The dental work took 3 appointments and left Meyer with 4 fillings and a completely revised understanding of medical care. The American dentist, a civilian contractor, not military, worked with the same methodical care that Tibbs had shown, treating Meyer's teeth as if they belonged to a paying customer rather than an enemy prisoner. "Why do you do this?" Meyer asked during the final appointment, struggling with English that had improved dramatically over months of immersion. "Do what?" the dentist asked, adjusting his tools. "Treat prisoners like people." The dentist paused, looked at Meyer with genuine puzzlement. "What else would we treat you like?" It was a question that contained within it an entire philosophical system, a worldview that Meyer was only beginning to understand. In Germany, human worth had been calibrated according to elaborate hierarchies: race, nationality, political loyalty, usefulness to the state. You were valued insofar as you served the folk, the party, the Führer's vision. Individual dignity was subordinate to collective purpose. In America, or at least in this small pocket of America, this prisoner of war camp in Texas, human worth seemed to be assumed as a baseline, something you possessed simply by existing. They treated prisoners decently, not because of what prisoners had done or might do, but because the alternative violated their understanding of how civilization functioned. The irony was almost unbearable. The weekend baseball games became Meyer's education in American culture. Guards and prisoners played together, not formally sanctioned, just something that emerged organically as men with time and competitive instincts found common ground. Meyer had never played baseball before, couldn't understand the Baroque complexity of its rules, but he stood in the outfield and tried to catch the ball when it came his way, and Americans shouted instructions that gradually began to make sense. "You're doing fine," a guard named Thompson told him, after Meyer missed an easy fly ball for the 3rd consecutive game. Thompson was from Oklahoma, 24 years old, a farmer before the war. "Baseball's not something you learn quick. Takes time. In Germany we played football," Meyer offered. "Soccer, you call it." "Yeah. I never understood soccer. Seems like they run around a lot without much happening." They both laughed at the cultural impasse. Then Thompson taught Meyer how to hold the baseball bat properly, how to watch the pitcher's release, how to swing through the ball rather than at it. The lesson was patient, detailed, and completely unnecessary. Meyer was a prisoner, Thompson a guard. They had no obligation toward each other beyond the formal requirements of captivity. Yet here they were, spending a Sunday afternoon in mutual instruction, because that was apparently what people did when given the opportunity. "You got family back in Germany?" Thompson asked later, sitting in the shade with bottles of Coca-Cola that tasted like nothing Meyer had experienced before. Sweet, effervescent, distinctly American. "A sister in Hamburg," Meyer said. "If she survived the bombing. I haven't heard from her since 1943. "I'm sorry," Thompson said, "and meant it. This whole war's a mess. My brother's in the Pacific right now fighting the Japanese. I worry about him every day." They sat in silence for a while, two men on opposite sides of a global conflict, both worried about siblings, both hoping the war would end soon and let everyone go home. The absurdity of it, that they could sit here peacefully while their countries tried to kill each other, was not lost on Meyer. "Why did you join?" he asked. "The army, I mean." Thompson shrugged. "Pearl Harbor. Everyone joined after Pearl Harbor. Seemed like the right thing to do, defending the country." He paused. "Why did you join?" Meyer considered the question, tried to find an honest answer. "I believed what they told us. About Germany's destiny, about the enemies surrounding us, about the need for living space. I believed we were defending ourselves, making Germany great again after the humiliation of Versailles. And now I think maybe I was lied to." Thompson nodded slowly. "Yeah, that seems like a reasonable conclusion." The education continued in smaller ways, daily revelations that accumulated like snowfall. The camp had a library, an actual library with books in German and English, newspapers, magazines. Prisoners could check out volumes and read in their barracks or outside during free time. Meyer discovered American literature this way, struggled through Steinbeck and Hemingway with a dictionary, began to understand a country through its stories. They were allowed to write letters home, 2 per month, each one censored but not prohibited. Meyer wrote to his sister in Hamburg, careful epistles describing his captivity in neutral terms that wouldn't alarm censors on either side. He never received responses. The mail system from Germany was erratic at best, non-existent at worst by late 1944. But the act of writing helped him process his experience, gave him a way to articulate the contradictions he was living through. The most profound shift came gradually, a slow erosion of certainty rather than a sudden revelation. Meyer found himself questioning assumptions he'd held since childhood, re-examining the narratives that had shaped his understanding of the world. If Americans weren't barbaric monsters, what else had been a lie? If the food abundance here was normal rather than exceptional, what did that say about German economic management? If individual dignity was treated as axiomatic rather than earned, what did that imply about the Nazi emphasis on collective subordination? By the summer of 1945, as news filtered into the camp about Germany's collapse, Meyer felt like he was living in two realities simultaneously. One was the Germany of his memories, proud, disciplined, culturally superior, fighting a justified war against encircling enemies. The other was the Germany being revealed through American newspapers and radio reports, genocidal, aggressive, built on lies so comprehensive that entire worldviews dissolved when exposed to evidence. The first photographs from liberated concentration camps arrived in June. The camp commandant, a career officer who took the Geneva Convention seriously, made them available in the library, believing that prisoners had a right to know what their country had done. Many prisoners refused to look. Others looked and declared them propaganda, faked images designed to justify Allied brutality. Meyer looked and felt something inside himself break. He'd known about the camps, vaguely. Everyone in Germany had known about the camps, places where political enemies were sent, where Jews were concentrated for eventual deportation. The propaganda had described them as work camps, relocation centers, necessary measures in wartime. The photographs showed something different. Bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons with hollow eyes, industrial facilities for murder. "These are fake," a prisoner said, staring at the images with desperate intensity. "They have to be fake." "They're not fake," Meyer said quietly. "Look at them. Really look at them. You believe American propaganda now. You've become their tool." "I believe my eyes," Meyer replied. "And I believe that maybe, just maybe, we were wrong about everything." Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan surrendered in August. The war was over, but Meyer's captivity continued. Not as punishment, but as simple logistics. Millions of prisoners needed to be repatriated. Ships were in short supply, and Germany itself was a devastated landscape of rubble and occupation zones. The American military made no secret of the timeline. Prisoners would be sent home as transportation became available, probably over the next 2 to 3 years. Meyer found he wasn't particularly eager to rush back. What awaited him in Hamburg? His apartment had certainly been destroyed in the bombing raids. His sister was probably dead. He'd received no letters in 2 years, which suggested the worst. His job at the factory, making precision instruments for the Wehrmacht, no longer existed. The factory itself likely reduced to ruins. And beyond these personal losses was the larger catastrophe of national collapse. The revelation of crimes that would stain German identity for generations. Better to stay in Texas a while longer. Better to keep working at the canning factory, keep improving his English, keep learning how a functional society operated. Better to delay the return to a homeland that had betrayed everything he'd believed about it. The camp routine continued, but with changes that reflected the war's end. Security relaxed slightly. Prisoners could now leave the camp on supervised trips. Church services, educational programs, cultural events in Houston. Meyer attended his first American movie in October of 1945, a Western starring Gary Cooper that made no sense to him but fascinated him nonetheless. The casual wealth on display, cars, clothing, buildings, the sheer abundance of everything, seemed like science fiction. "Is America really like this?" he asked Thompson, who'd accompanied the group to the movie. "Pretty much," Thompson said. "I mean, that's Hollywood, so everything's a bit prettier than real life. But yeah, most folks have cars, have enough to eat, have decent houses. That's just normal." "It's not normal," Meyer said. "It's exceptional. It's what we were told only Germany could achieve once we won the war and had proper living space." Thompson looked uncomfortable. "Well, I don't know much about German politics, but from where I'm sitting, seems like you folks were sold a bad bill of goods." "A bad bill of goods." Meyer turned the phrase over in his mind, appreciating its understated accuracy. Yes, that was exactly what had happened. They'd been sold a vision of German destiny, of racial superiority, of necessary struggle against inferior peoples, and it had all been a lie, wrapped in patriotic fervor and backed by systematic violence. The work at the canning factory became something more than occupation. Meyer took pride in it, learned the machinery, began training newer prisoners on proper procedures. The American foreman noticed his competence and gave him additional responsibilities: managing inventory, coordinating shift schedules, maintaining equipment. In another context, it would have been a career. Here, it was just prisoner labor, but it was labor that demonstrated something important, that Meyer had skills, intelligence, capacity for growth that had nothing to do with ideology or nationality. "You're good at this," the factory manager said during a routine inspection. His name was Henderson, a 50-year-old Texan with 3 sons serving in the military and a pragmatic approach to prisoner labor. "When you get repatriated, you should find work in manufacturing. You've got the aptitude for it." "Germany doesn't have manufacturing anymore," Meyer said. "Just ruins. Germany will rebuild," Henderson replied. "Might take 20 years, might take 50, but it'll rebuild. And when it does, it'll need people who know how to make things, how to organize production, how to run factories efficiently. People like you." The comment stayed with Meyer, nested in his thoughts like a seed waiting for proper conditions to germinate. Henderson was right. Germany would rebuild eventually. The question was, what kind of Germany would emerge from the rubble? What values would shape its reconstruction? What lessons would be learned or ignored? Meyer's 3 years in captivity gave him time to formulate answers to those questions. to develop a vision of what post-war Germany might become if it learned the right lessons. A Germany that treated human dignity as axiomatic. A Germany that valued individual rights over collective ideology. A Germany that looked to America and Britain not as enemies but as models for how free societies functioned. When the repatriation order finally came in March of 1948, Meyer had gained 32 pounds, completed 2 years of correspondence education in business management, saved $400 from his factory wages, and developed a fluent understanding of English. He also had something less tangible but more valuable, a completely reconstructed worldview, built on the ruins of Nazi propaganda and strengthened by 3 years of evidence that contradicted everything he'd been taught. Hamburg in April of 1948 looked like God had taken an eraser to a city. Entire neighborhoods existed only as rubble fields, architectural features reduced to abstract patterns of broken brick and twisted metal. The harbor, once Germany's gateway to the world, was a tangle of sunken ships and destroyed docks. People lived in cellars, in Quonset huts provided by the British occupation forces, in improvised shelters that barely deserved the name. Meyer stood at the train station, trying to orient himself in a landscape he no longer recognized. The street grid remained the same, but everything vertical had been destroyed. It was like returning to a home where all the furniture had been removed, leaving only the floor plan to suggest what had once existed. His sister was alive. He discovered this through the British occupation authorities after 2 days of bureaucratic navigation. She'd survived the firebombing of July 1943 by taking shelter in the basement of a building that collapsed around her, but left the basement intact. She now worked for the British military government, translating documents and helping administer ration programs. Their reunion was awkward, emotional, complicated by 3 years of separation, and the impossibility of summarizing their respective experiences. How could Meyer explain Texas to someone who'd survived the Hamburg firestorm? How could she explain the firestorm to someone who'd spent the war's end working in a canning factory with adequate food and dental care? "You look healthy," she said, studying him with the careful attention of someone assessing whether a miracle was real. "Too healthy. I thought prisoners." "American prisoners were treated well," Meyer interrupted. "Better than German soldiers were treated by Germany in many cases." She absorbed this information silently, filing it away in whatever mental framework she'd developed for processing the war's contradictions. They sat in her small apartment, 2 rooms in a partially reconstructed building, electricity available 3 hours per day, water from a communal pump, and Meyer tried to explain America. He told her about the canning factory, about 8-hour workdays and safety equipment, about the baseball games, about guards who treated prisoners like humans rather than enemies, about the library, the dental care, the food abundance that had seemed incomprehensible at first, about Captain Tibbs, the British doctor who'd saved his life and unknowingly initiated his political and philosophical transformation. "They didn't have to treat us well," he said, searching for words adequate to the experience. "The Geneva Convention required certain minimum standards, but what we received went beyond minimums. It was how they treated their own people, not perfectly, not without flaws, but with a baseline respect for human dignity that we never had in Germany." His sister listened, occasionally asking questions, her face reflecting the same internal struggle Meyer had experienced in Texas. The difficulty of reconciling propaganda with evidence, expectation with reality. She'd spent 5 years under Nazi rule, then 3 under occupation. She'd seen the worst of German ideology and the best of Allied victory. Meyer's testimony simply added detail to a picture she'd already begun assembling. "What do we do now?" she asked finally. "Germany is destroyed. The Reich is gone. We have to rebuild, but rebuild into what?" Meyer had thought about this question for 3 years, had refined his answer through countless conversations with American guards, German prisoners, and his own conscience. We rebuild into something different. We learn from defeat. We look at countries like America and Britain and ask ourselves why they won. Not just militarily, but morally, economically, culturally. And then we build a Germany that incorporates those lessons. It was an idealistic answer, perhaps naive, certainly complicated by the realities of occupation and partition. But it was sincere, born from lived experience rather than ideology, and it represented the transformation that Meyer had undergone from true believer in Nazi mythology to advocate for democratic capitalism. Over the following years, as Germany began its slow crawl toward recovery, Meyer put his Texas education to practical use. He found work with the British Occupation Administration, helping restart industrial production in Hamburg. He later worked for a manufacturing company, rebuilding Germany's precision instrument industry, eventually becoming a manager, known for treating workers with respect and implementing American-style safety protocols. He kept 2 items from his prisoner of war experience until his death in the 1980s. A photograph of the Texas camp, showing rows of barracks under a wide sky, and a letter from Captain David Tibbs that arrived in 1949. The letter was brief, typed on official British military stationery, addressed to Unteroffizier Friedrich Meyer, formerly of the Wehrmacht. Tibbs had tracked down his patients after the war, sending letters to those he'd operated on at Anzio, wanting to confirm they'd survived and recovered. The letter contained no philosophy, no grand statements about humanity or healing. It simply asked about Meyer's health, wished him well in his recovery and reconstruction efforts, and concluded with a single sentence that Meyer would read repeatedly over the decades. "I hope the peace serves you better than the war did." The human capacity for transformation remains one of history's most remarkable constants. We are not fixed entities, but dynamic processes, shaped by experience, capable of radical revision when confronted with evidence that contradicts our assumptions. Friedrich Meyer entered World War II as a believer in Nazi ideology, convinced of German superiority and the necessity of violent expansion. He left it as an advocate for democratic values, convinced that human dignity transcended nationality and that the best societies were those that protected individual rights rather than subordinating them to collective purpose. The transformation required 3 distinct shocks to his worldview. First, the experience of being saved by an enemy doctor who treated him with the same care as Allied soldiers. Second, 3 years in American captivity that demonstrated the practical superiority of democratic capitalism over authoritarian control. And third, the revelation of Nazi crimes that demolished any remaining justification for the ideology he'd once embraced. Each shock was necessary, but not sufficient. Tibbs's surgery saved Meyer's life, but didn't immediately change his mind. It merely created cognitive dissonance, a crack in the propaganda. The Texas prisoner of war camp widened that crack through sustained exposure to alternative models of social organization. The concentration camp photographs shattered what remained, forcing Meyer to confront the moral bankruptcy of the system he'd served. The broader historical significance lies not in Meyer's individual transformation, but in what it represented. He was one of millions of Germans who underwent similar revisions after World War II, who confronted the collapse of Nazi mythology and rebuilt their worldviews on more sustainable foundations. The success of post-war German democracy, despite its complications, despite the Cold War division, despite the burden of historical guilt, testifies to the scale of this collective transformation. Captain David Tibbs performed thousands of surgeries during the war, saved hundreds of lives, and received several military decorations for his service. He returned to Britain in 1946, practiced medicine in London for 30 years, and rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. When interviewed for a BBC documentary in the 1970s, he was asked about the incident at Anzio, about refusing to be taken prisoner. It wasn't courage, he said, uncomfortable with the framing. It was arithmetic. More people lived if I stayed. That's all. Medicine isn't about heroism. It's about making the calculations that save the most lives and then doing the work. But of course, it was more than arithmetic. Tibbs's decision to treat German and British soldiers with equal care, his insistence on maintaining medical neutrality in the midst of combat, his refusal to let military hierarchy override medical necessity. These were moral choices, not just practical calculations. They reflected a worldview in which human life possessed intrinsic value, regardless of nationality, in which professional ethics transcended political conflict, in which civilization persisted, even when everything around it suggested barbarism. That worldview, that stubborn insistence on human dignity, even in the midst of organized violence, is what saved Friedrich Mayer's life and ultimately contributed to his transformation. The surgery was the technical means, but the underlying philosophy was the catalyst. Mayer recognized in Tibbs's hands the presence of something his own country had abandoned, the belief that humans deserved respect and care simply by virtue of being human. History remembers the great battles, the strategic decisions, the political transformations. It forgets the individual moments of mercy, the small choices that compound over time into cultural shifts. But those moments matter, perhaps more than the battles. They represent the thin thread of civilization that persists through conflict, the human capacity for empathy that survives even systematic attempts to destroy it. In a half-destroyed Italian shop in January 1944, a British doctor refused to be taken prisoner because he had patients who needed him. That refusal, and the philosophy behind it, helped transform a German soldier from Nazi true believer to advocate for democratic values. The ripple effects of that transformation, Mayer's work rebuilding Germany, his treatment of workers, his advocacy for systems that respected human dignity, extended through decades and influenced hundreds of lives. History is built from such moments, from small refusals to accept the logic of violence, from individual choices to maintain humanity when abandoning it would be easier. The great ideological conflicts of the 20th century, fascism versus democracy, totalitarianism versus freedom, were ultimately decided not just on battlefields, but in the accumulated choices of individuals who refused to surrender their principles, even when surrounded by chaos. Mayer kept Tibbs's letter until the end of his life, kept the photograph of the Texas camp, kept the memories of 3 years that contradicted everything he'd been taught. In the 1970s, working as a factory manager in rebuilt Hamburg, he would occasionally take the letter out and read it to young employees, wanting them to understand something about history that textbooks couldn't convey. "I fought in a war for an evil cause," he would say, "and everything I believed was proven wrong. But in the process of losing that war, I was saved 3 times. Once by an enemy doctor, once by enemy captivity, and once by confronting the truth about my own country. The war destroyed millions of lives, including people I knew and loved, but it also gave me the tools to become something better than what I was." That's the paradox of history. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the worst suffering. The lesson, insofar as there was one, was about the permanence of human capacity for change. Mayer had been 23 when the war began, convinced of Nazi ideology, willing to die for German expansion. He was 29 when repatriated, convinced of democratic values, willing to work for German reconstruction along American and British lines. The transformation wasn't easy or painless. It required the destruction of everything he'd believed, the exposure of lies he'd internalized, the recognition that he'd served evil while thinking he was serving good. But it was possible. That's what matters. Human beings are not locked into their starting positions. We can learn, adapt, revise, grow. The propaganda that shapes us in youth can be overcome by experience in adulthood. The ideologies that seem absolute can be revealed as contingent. The enemies we're taught to hate can demonstrate, through their actions, that they're more humane than the systems we defend. Captain Tibbs saved Friedrich Meyer's legs on an operating table in Italy. American prisoner of war administrators saved his health in Texas. And Meyer himself completed the transformation by choosing to learn from those experiences rather than resisting them, by accepting the evidence of his senses rather than clinging to comfortable lies. The rest, the rebuilding, the democratic Germany, the lasting peace between former enemies, was built on millions of such transformations, each one as improbable and necessary as Meyer's, each one a small victory for human dignity over ideological certainty. In the end, perhaps that's the only victory that matters.